There's a question that seems insane, yet the more you think about it, the more it haunts you. If the world had never known war, who would we be today? There would be no soldiers, no gunfire, no air raid sirens, no children born amid the sounds of bombs, no maps redrawn after every conquest, no mothers sitting by their sons' graves saying, "He died for his country." Just a stream of history, tranquil, no glory, no scars, no triumphs, a world that seems like a paradise, but could also be a gilded cage. This story isn't a beautiful dream, it's a challenge to your imagination and courage, the courage to face the possibility that, without war, the world might not necessarily be a better place. And if there is a moment on this journey that makes you stop and think, if you find yourself listening with your heart, not just your ears, then don't forget to follow so we can meet again in other stories, where the past is rewritten and the future is seen with new eyes. So now, imagine a world where people never knew how to kill each other for power, for borders, or for some sacred cause. A world that never had war, and from there, we will begin a journey to explore something that seems impossible. A different history, a different humanity, a different price for peace. Perhaps in the course of history, nothing is as simultaneously great and painful as war. It is the deepest gash on the body of humanity, but also the most powerful catalyst for evolution. It destroys, erases, and steals. But it also awakens, transforms, and drives progress. We love peace, yet, ironically, most of the revolutionary leaps in history were sparked by war. Without World War I, there would be no dissolution of classical empires, no modern political map. Without World War II, there would be no United Nations, no Universal Declaration of Human Rights, no powerful decolonization movements across Asia and Africa. Without the Cold War, there would be no space race, no internet, no GPS that you use every day. History is so ironic. It's like a fire. It both destroys and illuminates. And then, another question echoes. If humanity had never lit the fire of war, would the lamp of civilization have been bright enough? Imagine a child growing up in that world. He would never hear stories of war or days of falling bombs. He wouldn't need to learn the history of victory or defeat, with no memories of separation or sacrifice. But there would also be no stories of courage on the brink of life and death. There would be no tales of resilience from the front lines, no poetry written under fire, no novels shaped by the experience of conflict. A world without war. Would it still be moving? Would it still be noble? Would people still have ideals to fight for something bigger than themselves? We often fear war. But sometimes, what's more terrifying than war is a world with nothing to fight for. A world that's cold, indifferent, without suffering, and without hope. If war is a mirror that reflects the dark side of humanity, then without it, would we have the courage to face ourselves? Peace can be the destination, but what would the path to it be like if there were no war? From this point on, you and I, we are stepping into a completely new land, a parallel timeline where war was never born. No Genghis Khan, no Napoleon, no Pearl Harbor, no Normandy, no Bosnia, no Rwanda, no divided nations. No one would be forced to take up arms, and no one would be glorified for having fallen. Only one question remains. If there had never been war, what would have changed? And is the price of absolute peace more expensive than blood? To imagine a world without war, we cannot simply erase every conflict, every battle, every general. We must go back to where it all began. Not the time of the Romans, not ancient China, not when Napoleon conquered Europe, or when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, but in prehistoric times. The very first moment when one group of people threw rocks at another to dispute a water source, a field, or a cave. That was when war was born, not as an event, but as an awakened instinct. So, what if, in that very moment, the instinct for violence was not chosen? Imagine, about 10,000 years ago, as humanity transitioned from a hunter-gatherer existence to the first sedentary era. At that time, tribes began to compete for land, water, and territory. Competition, as a law of nature, gradually led to conflict, and conflict, if not resolved with words, would lead to violence. But let's try to change one small detail. Just one detail. A different psychological step forward. Suppose that, in a primitive group of people, the development of social awareness happened a few generations earlier. They didn't see the other as a threat, but as part of a larger community. Instead of the instinct to protect my tribe, they developed the notion of symbiosis, cooperation, and resource sharing based on dialogue. Suppose that the first conflict wasn't resolved with rocks, sticks, or blood, but was defused by a single principle, the agreement to coexist. Let's call that turning point. The moment humanity refused violence for the first time. And from that point, history began to flow in a completely different direction. In our timeline, humans learned to fight before they learned to negotiate. We built walls before we built bridges. We forged weapons before we forged a common language. But in this imaginary timeline, everything is reversed. When another tribe approaches, they don't immediately brace for an attack. They are invited to share the fire, to exchange food and techniques, to intermarry, to build relationships. There are no trenches, no leader ordering the slaughter, no deeply ingrained language of the enemy. Only one thing is remembered and passed down. They are not the enemy. They are just like us. And from here, the entire structure of social evolution changes. There is no hierarchy of power based on battle achievements, because there are no battle achievements to boast about. There are no revered military leaders, because no one brings home a victory. There is no glorification of violence, because there are no legends of battlefield heroes. Instead, primitive society evolves based on peaceful cooperation, farming skills, construction, and dialogue. The strong person is not the one who wields a sword best, but the one who connects people best. It's as if, from a very early stage, humanity chose negotiation over bloodshed, creation over destruction, communication over domination. And what's more important than anything is, that choice wasn't just an action. It became an ideology. Children are taught conflict is an opportunity to understand each other, not to eliminate each other. Adults believe if there is a dispute, find a win-win solution, because no one truly wins when someone else hurts. The elders tell stories of their ancestors. We once stood on the brink of war, but we chose a different path, and thanks to that, we are still here, together. You might ask, is that even possible? Many anthropologists have asked that question, and they have found some small pieces of evidence, primitive communities that lived for a very long time, very stably, with no signs of war for hundreds of years. Researchers call these zones of non-conflict, societies where disputes are resolved through mediation, not violence. Not many, but they exist. That proves war is not destiny, it is a choice. And if from the beginning humanity refused to make that choice, what would have changed? No standing armies, no national defense budgets, no technology developed for the purpose of destruction, no arms race, no winners and losers. Perhaps just groups of people who learned to share tools, to tell stories instead of chronicling casualties, and to build a common language instead of encoding attack commands. Try to imagine this small detail. When a metal tool was discovered that could penetrate animal hides more easily than a stone, in our timeline, humanity turned it into a weapon. But in this imaginary timeline, people didn't use it for killing, but for cutting vegetables, carving wood, making musical instruments. And when fire was invented, people didn't use it to burn down an opposing village, but to cook meals together, to tell stories together. Civilization began not with blood, but with symbiosis. History started not with destruction, but with sharing. That was the first turn. A small moment, but it shifted the entire axis of history. And that very turn will open up a world you are about to enter. A world without war. The new flow of history. How did the world change? 1. Antiquity, when empires were not born of blood. Imagine you are stepping into a timeline of antiquity, a world without war. There are no tribes clashing over hunting grounds, No armies sweeping across borders, no fortified city walls to defend against enemies, no mighty emperors expanding their territory with a sword. So, what would the ancient world look like? Without war, would there be Rome? In real history, the Roman Empire is a symbol of power and glory, but also the most notorious conqueror. Rome conquered almost all of ancient Europe through violence and iron discipline. But in the timeline without war, Rome never exists as we know it. Instead of becoming an invasion machine, Rome might just be a federation of city-states where commerce and scholarship flourish. There would be no bloody Colosseum, but open-air theaters presenting philosophy, drama, and art. There would be no legions of conquerors, but caravans carrying knowledge from east to west. Rome would become a cradle of democratic thought, science, and cross-cultural connection, not an empire of militarism and control. Egypt, where the pyramids are not warrior tombs. Without war, the ancient Egyptian civilization no longer needs armies to protect the Nile River or to expand the pharaoh's authority. Instead, Egypt might become the leading center of medicine, astronomy, and hydraulic agriculture. The pyramids, instead of being a tomb to show off power, could be astronomical observatories, repositories of knowledge, or stone libraries containing millennia of history. Without war, Egyptian farmers are not conscripted into the army. They stay, cultivate their land, and improve their tools. The rivers are no longer stained with blood, but flow only with fertile silt. China, the rise of wisdom, not territory. In the real world, ancient China witnessed hundreds of wars between dynasties and feudal states, from the spring and autumn periods to the Qin, Han, and Tang. But if there were no war, the unification of China could come from a different path, the path of ideas. Instead of Emperor Qin Shi Huang unifying the country with the sword, philosophical schools like Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism could connect different regions through dialogue, scholarship, and mutual respect. There would be no Great Wall, but perhaps a Great Library, or Great Wall of Books, where knowledge from north to south is preserved, shared, and expanded. There would be no weapons but silk, paper, compasses, and gunpowder used for peace. The Chinese people would not need to prove their strength with territory, but with the harmonious development between humanity and nature. Other civilizations, formed without invasion. In the Americas, there would be no Aztec sacrifices of warriors to appease the gods. In Africa, there would be no empires expanding with swords. In India, Buddhism and Hinduism would spread not through empires, but through communities of scholars. Civilizations would grow like a network, not like snakes swallowing one another. There would be no military leaders, no monuments to victory, only spiritual leaders, and monuments honoring knowledge, ethics, art, and medicine. But would there really be no conflict? Even without war, humans still have a nature of competition, desire, and possession. So civilizations cannot avoid friction, but instead of using violence, they resolve it differently. Technological competition. Who can make better farming tools, more effective medicine? Academic debates. Philosophers and scholars from different civilizations debate and dialogue in public forums, like intellectual Olympics. Artistic rivalry. Painting, architecture, and music become soft weapons to express power and identity. The winner doesn't take land, but gains respect. The loser doesn't lose their life, but learns. It's a world where victory is development, not destruction. 2. The Middle Ages. When faith was no longer stained with blood. Imagine no crusades, no Genghis Khan sweeping his army from Asia to Europe, no empires occupying lands with force and imposing beliefs with the sword. Instead, civilizations enter a completely different Middle Ages, a period of light in the dark, where faith and intellect walk hand in hand, not in conflict. Religion spreads through compassion, not the sword. In real history, many of the world's great religions were spread through violence, war, and coercion, even though the core of their teachings was peace and love. But in this timeline, where war never existed, religion is no longer a banner for secular powers to exploit. Christianity spreads not through crusaders, but through healers, teachers, and people who bring hope to distant lands. Islam is not distorted by conquest, but develops as an empire of knowledge, where mathematics, astronomy, and medicine become a means of spreading its message. Buddhism and Hinduism are not divided by ethnic conflicts, but run parallel like two rivers flowing in the same direction, seeking enlightenment within the human heart. When there is no bloodshed for belief, people begin to listen to each other. Islamic philosophers debate with Christian theologians at interfaith councils. Tibetan monks and Chinese scholars exchange letters about the nature of consciousness. Faith becomes the language of internal exploration, no longer a barrier between civilizations. No Genghis Khan, only Genghis the scholar. In the real world, Genghis Khan built the largest empire in history through war, destruction, and fear. But in a world without war, he never becomes the son of heaven. He is still born on the Mongolian steppe, but instead of leading horsemen to conquer the West, he leads the largest education and learning movement across Asia and Europe. The Great Library on Horseback is an initiative that carries books, knowledge, and art with nomadic caravans, connecting dozens of peoples from Persia to China, from Russia to India. The Mongols don't sow fear, they gather wisdom. They don't destroy cities, they help build mobile academic centers. Their empire is not measured by maps, but by the influence of knowledge. No feudal wars. Academic city-states arise. The real world was once dominated by feudalism, lords with their own armies, clashing with one another, hindering social development. But in the timeline without war, there are no feudal lords. City-states are not built to be fortresses, but to protect schools, research institutes, and libraries. The power of a leader doesn't come from the number of troops, but from the number of research projects, brilliant students, and inventions that help the community. Where there was once a fortress, now stands an academy. Each city-state is a small nation with its own expertise. Some excel in medicine, others in mathematics, others in fine arts. Instead of sending spies to gather intelligence, city-states send scholars to exchange ideas, forming alliances of knowledge. No war, but is there revolution? The biggest problem of the real Middle Ages was stagnation. Knowledge was confined to monasteries, and the aristocracy ruled by bloodline, not by ethics. So, if there is no war, who will break the stagnation? The answer is public discourse, ideas, creativity. No war, but there is still struggle. The people don't rise up with swords, but with words, with books, with plays satirizing the rulers. Revolutions still happen, but they are revolutions of ideas. The Age of Enlightenment arrives 300 years earlier because it isn't interrupted by bloodshed. Journalism, the printing press, painting, and music become sharp weapons to criticize injustice. Change happens without bloodshed, but it is deeper, more lasting, and leaves no legacy of hatred. The world map, without borders. Without war, the world of the Middle Ages develops as a soft, interconnected network. There are no hard borders, no disputed territories, no forbidden zones. Regions of intersection like the Middle East, the Balkans, and Central Asia become places of academic and cultural exchange, not hotspots of conflict. Africa is not colonized, but is a partner in biotech alliances based on indigenous herbs. The Americas are not invaded, but are allies in transoceanic trade projects using peaceful fleets. Oceans are no longer barriers, but bridges. People are not divided by nationalism, but connected by common ideals, progress, cooperation, and humanity. The Dark Ages become the dawn. In real history, the Middle Ages were often called the Dark Ages, because war, oppression, and ignorance were widespread. But in a world that never had war, that century becomes the dawn of humanity. Without violence, people learn to look inward. Without hatred, people learn to heal one another. Without fear, people dare to dream of a future where knowledge is the only power. 3. Modern era. When revolutions didn't need bloodshed and science didn't serve weapons. Imagine the modern era again. No war, no colonial empires, no cannons firing to open ports, no warships sailing into strange bays. Would there still be revolution? Would technology still explode? Could the world really progress without the shock of bloodshed? No war, but there is still an industrial revolution. In the real world, The Industrial Revolution erupted in 18th century England, partly due to the need to produce weapons, increase national defense, and serve colonial empires. But in a world without war, the military need doesn't exist. So, what would drive technological development? The answer is, people want to live better, not to dominate one another. Machines are invented not to produce cannons, but to free people from hard labor. The steam engine doesn't pull artillery. It pulls faster ambulances and transports food to distant areas. Electricity is used 50 years earlier because it's not prioritized for mines or military factories, but for lighting cities for round-the-clock learning. Without war, technology still develops. It even develops more sustainably and humanely because it's not dominated by the profits of weapon manufacturers or the need for destruction. No bloodshed, but still freedom. Real history shows us. Many democratic revolutions, from France to America, were tied to bloodshed, civil war, and terror. But in a world without war, democracies are born. Without guns. The French Revolution doesn't start with beheading the king. It starts with millions of people signing the largest petition in history, demanding a constitution. In the U.S., the 13 colonies don't fight Britain. They negotiate and wage a legal battle for decades to achieve self-determination through a federation treaty. The abolitionist movement doesn't lead to a civil war. It becomes a cultural wave, where writers, musicians, and teachers change the hearts of the people. When there is no war, freedom is not a prize won by force. It's the result of civilized maturity. No colonialism, but global exchange. The real world witnessed European empires ravaging Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with war, slavery, and exploitation. In this new history, there is no colonialism. Europeans don't use cannons to open Japan. They send scientists, doctors, and explorers to exchange knowledge. India doesn't become the jewel in the crown of Britain. It becomes a respected center of mathematics, philosophy, and culture. Africa is not carved up with a ruler, but enters the modern era on its own terms, with support from a global network of knowledge. Instead of domination, there is dialogue. Instead of plunder, there is collaboration. Instead of planting a flag, there is a handshake. No weapons. Science focuses on life. In real history, a large part of scientific breakthroughs happen during or after wars, because resources are poured into national defense. But when there is no war, scientists are not forced to serve the country with destructive technology. Einstein doesn't write a letter to the U.S. president asking to build the atomic bomb. He devotes his entire life to applied physics and public education. Turing is not forced to develop a code-breaking machine for war. He fully commits to developing the first computers for education and health. Vaccines, clean water systems, solar energy technology are invented a century earlier because they aren't suppressed by military priorities. When there's no worry about destructive weapons, people can focus on creating to save lives, not to take them. Without pain, would art lose its depth? A nagging question arises. If there is no war, would art still have emotion? Without tragedy, would music, poetry, and painting still touch the human heart? The answer is, art doesn't need blood to touch the heart. It only needs truth and desire. Writers wouldn't have to describe battlefields. They would portray the inner lives of people in a peaceful world full of its own challenges. Musicians would no longer write a requiem for the fallen soldier, but a triumphant ode for a matured planet. Painters wouldn't paint falling bombs. They would paint Earth from space, as blue as a child's eyes. Art would transform from sorrow to hope, from resistance to revelation, from the past to the future, the modern era. Not a nightmare, but a launch pad. When the world is no longer entangled in war, people dedicate time, intellect, and compassion to truly important issues. How to live in harmony with nature. How to ensure no one is left behind in a modernizing world. How to ensure that development doesn't mean destruction. The modern era becomes a launch pad for a 21st century without the smoke of guns, but full of shooting stars. Finally, the present and future, when peace is a gift, and also the ultimate challenge. The 20th century, when peace became a given, In real history, the 20th century was the bloodiest era. 2 world wars, the Cold War, terrorism, genocide, ethnic conflicts. But in a world without war, the 20th century doesn't begin with the sound of bombs, but with the sound of connection. The telephone, radio, television, the internet aren't tools of propaganda. They are true lifelines between people. Globalization isn't a trend imposed by superpowers. It's the result of global consensus, born from the fact that no one needs to defend their sovereignty with force. Organizations like the United Nations aren't born from the ashes of war, but from the desire to co-create a shared world from a very early stage. People enter the 20th century no longer afraid of each other, but curious about each other. Without borders of force, nations open up new borders, borders of education, health, environment, energy. No war. Would we still explore space? In our timeline, the space race between the US and the Soviet Union began with political conflict, a Cold War between two sides. But in a history without war, there are no opposing factions. Would we still explore space? The answer is yes, but not to claim territory, but to understand ourselves better. The moon landing is no longer a political statement. It's a graduation exam for humanity. Are we mature enough to leave the cradle of Earth? The International Space Station isn't the result of a post-war compromise, but the product of a global education program where millions of students dream of flying to the stars. The search for extraterrestrial life is no longer for defensive purposes, but simply to find friends. No war, no space race, just a shared journey to the cosmos. Too much peace. Would humanity lose its survival instinct? This is the hardest question. If war is a shock that makes people wake up, then when there is no sorrow to remember, would we fall asleep in comfort? Would a generation raised in peace understand its value? Without a common enemy like war, would humanity have enough reason to unite? The answer isn't easy, but it could be. Precisely because there is no common enemy, people are forced to look at themselves. They can't blame war. They can't hide behind guns. They have to confront the gap between rich and poor, moral decay, dependence on technology, emotional atrophy, all of it no longer masked by war. A world without war is not a paradise, but it is a world where individual responsibility cannot be shifted to the shoulders of armed conflicts. No war, but there is struggle. In that world, struggle doesn't disappear. It transforms. Instead of armed conflict, it's the fight against poverty, climate change, disease, and loneliness. Instead of violence, it's intellectual debate, academic critique, and creative competition. Instead of destroying one another, it's working together to overcome the limits of the human species. The greatest maturation of this world isn't in the absence of war, but in the transformation of the instinct to conquer into the courage to create. And if we could live in that world, try to imagine you are hearing this story not in a post-war world, but in a world that has never known war. You grew up without ever seeing a flag draped over a coffin. You love someone without worrying they'll be sent to the front lines. You read history books, but only see conferences, cooperation agreements, cultural alliances. You think differently, live differently, love differently, because you are not haunted by the wartime traumas of your parents or grandparents. Would you be grateful for life? Or would you take peace for granted and then lose it? And that is the imaginary timeline, where the world never knew war, no fire and smoke, no sacrifice, no triumph. Just people who learn to live together, to build, to mature, with understanding and kindness. We cannot live in that world, but we can learn from it, so that when we look back at our real history, we know what we need to cherish. And when we step into the future, we know that peace doesn't come from the absence of war, but from the presence of humanity. A deeper analysis. The consequences. No war exists. Does human nature change? We assume a world without war, but does that automatically mean humans are better? The nature of war isn't just gunfire, but the conflict between differences, power, belief, self-interest, and also fear. Without war, do these conflicts disappear, or do they just change form? We can imagine no soldiers killing, but perhaps still ideological domination. No fortresses, but a wall of silence between groups of people. No territorial occupation, but economic and cultural invasion. A world without war might be peaceful on the outside, but inside, there could be a quiet existence of injustice, like a calm lake hiding fierce undertows. How would humanity evolve without war? War was once one of the forces that made people reorganize society, inventing the state, legal systems, technology, and the spirit of solidarity. So, if there were no war, how would those elements develop? Political systems. Perhaps humanity would develop models of cooperative democracy earlier, without needing revolution or overthrow. But it's also possible that subtle, authoritarian regimes would still exist, because there would be no uprising to challenge them. A ruler might not need an army, but could control public consciousness through the media. Technology? If there's no need to invent weapons, radar, missiles, or the internet for war, where would people's energy go? It's very likely that medical, biological, and artificial intelligence technology would still develop, but the purpose would be to save lives, not to destroy them. However, there's also a risk. Lacking competition and pressure, technology might develop slowly, focusing on safety rather than breakthrough. Competitive drive. Without war, would people still have the drive to overcome and challenge themselves, or would they lose motivation, become complacent, and only know stability is happiness? No war, no heroes. For thousands of years of history, from Greece to Europe and Africa, the image of a hero has often been tied to war. Without war, would the world lose an important symbol of the human spirit? There would be no Martin Luther King Jr. rising up against segregation, no Gandhi challenging colonialism. Would humanity know about the courage of nonviolence? Perhaps in that world, a hero is the one who finds a vaccine, the one who opens a school, the one who mediates a conflict, not the one who holds a gun. It's a new hero, but also a harder image to identify, less glorious, with no armor or battles to be commemorated. 3 scenarios: bright, dark, and neutral. The bright scenario, where humanity grows up without hatred. Imagine a world where every child is born and never has to learn about the history of war. No curriculum teaches about battles, and no family memories are tied to separations at the front lines. In the minds of billions of people, enemy is a foreign concept. Borders are just geographical lines, no longer a reason to build fences or point guns. Without war, global resources aren't wasted on weapons, the military, training, and defense. Those huge budgets, instead of being poured into the fire, are redirected to education, health, the environment, and research. Epidemics might have been pushed back centuries earlier. Scientific projects, instead of being delayed by political instability, would have continued to develop across all eras. Cooperation between civilizations could happen earlier and more deeply. Without suspicion, people could expand trade, culture, and knowledge with each other without needing security forces or countermeasures. A healthy globalization, not based on imposition or colonization, but on understanding and consensus. The foundations of ethics, human rights, and justice are no longer lessons learned from tragedy, but values that are naturally lived and cultivated from the beginning. Human society would move toward a higher form of civilization, where people compete with intellect, creativity, and kindness. In that world, maybe there were Mozarts who weren't silenced by bombs, geniuses who weren't stuck in trenches, and peoples who were never erased from the map. A world where science is the headlight, ethics is the compass, education is the common religion, and every child has the chance to reach for limitless dreams. The dark scenario, when peace isn't enough to save humanity. But the absence of war doesn't automatically mean a better world. Perhaps, in a world without conflict, people lose the ability to resist. They become so used to order that they no longer recognize the more subtle forms of oppression. Control of information, ideological monopolies, and something called safety that is actually a harsh form of surveillance. No war, no revolution. Injustices exist in the shadows, quietly persisting for generations, because no one is suffering enough to rise up. Power systems could become unassailable because no one dares to think of change. Without struggle, great values like freedom, democracy, or human rights could be forgotten. Not because they were suppressed, but because they were never awakened. A peaceful society could be riddled with silent inequality, where the powerful rule with gentleness and the weak don't even know they are being ruled. Development could become stagnant because there is no life or death motivation. War, however terrible, was once the fire that ignited creative potential, forcing humanity to evolve to a higher level to survive. Without that fire, would we have enough pressure to create diamonds? Too much stability could also make people forget the value of freedom, no longer feeling the need to ask questions, no longer wanting to strive for more. That society, instead of evolving, would freeze in its own comfort zone. The price of peace, not easily measured in blood or money. A world without war. It sounds like something everyone wants. But sometimes, the presence of darkness makes people crave the light more. It's because of loss that people know how to cherish. It's because we've seen destruction that we understand the sanctity of building. In our real timeline, we paid a very high price for our maturation. Hundreds of millions of lives, thousands of years of instability, and wounds that have never healed. In the timeline without war, the price could be spiritual stagnation, a lack of will, and a peaceful world that never understood why it needed to be protected. A comparison between the real timeline and the timeline without war. If we look back at the entire length of human history, we see that war, however cruel and hateful, was what drove many turning points. So, if it didn't exist, would the flow of history still have a motivation to evolve? On technology, real history shows many great inventions, like radar, rockets, and the internet, were born from the need to fight and survive. In a world without war, those technologies would likely develop more slowly, but in a more humane direction, not to kill, but to live. There would be no atomic bomb, but perhaps miraculous leaps in medicine, education, and artificial intelligence would come much earlier. On politics, real history is full of bloody revolutions, overthrown regimes, and leaders who emerge from the smoke of conflict. But if the world was peaceful from the start, politics might stabilize earlier. But that would also mean a higher risk of conservatism. Authoritarian systems could last a very long time if no one dared to challenge them with force. On social awareness, the real world learned bitter lessons from war, that hatred only leads to destruction, that freedom and human rights are never a given. But in a world without war, would people ever realize those values if they had never lost them? They might live peacefully, but they could also be complacent, indifferent to subtle injustice. On culture and the heroic figure. We are too familiar with figures tied to resistance, national liberation, and overcoming adversity. In a world without war, the hero might not be a soldier, but a scientist, a teacher, a mediator. They are people who build quietly without needing to tear down. It's a beautiful image, but one that's easy to overlook, hard to engrave in the collective memory. And finally, on human emotion. Real history brings us to the extremes of human feeling. Pain, loss, hope, rebirth. These emotions make people write poetry, create music, and build masterpieces from the ruins. But if the world were too peaceful, people's souls might become flat, less emotional, less creative, and easily fall into a state of spiritual stagnation. In conclusion, a world without war is an ideal scenario, but it doesn't mean a smooth, easy path. Every choice comes with a trade-off. And when we look back at history, we understand that what's important is not whether we have war or not, but what we learn from both peace and destruction. Is a world without war what humanity truly needs? Throughout history, war has always been mentioned as a symbol of pain and loss, but at the same time, it's also what made people mature. We learn to love more because we've lost. We learn to forgive more because we've hated. We learn to cherish peace because we've lived in the smoke of conflict. Now, let's take a step back. Look at the big picture. A world without war doesn't mean a world without suffering, and a world that has had war doesn't mean the future has to continue with bloodshed. The core of it is here. People can learn from tragedy to avoid repeating it. The dream is not in the past, but in the choices of today. We cannot change the past. We can't erase the two world wars, the bloody conquests, or the mass graves scattered across the planet. But we can learn not to justify war, no matter what name it's given. We can choose education over propaganda, dialogue over slogans, trust over resentment. Today's generation, even if not born into war, is still living with its consequences, from borders that are still disputed to the intergenerational wounds in the minds of peoples. But this very generation is also the first to have the tools, the knowledge, and the opportunity to change the logic of history, not by forgetting war, but by understanding it, to have the courage to choose a different path. War might still exist, but people can choose not to use it. Like a sword on a table, it exists, but it is not drawn. We don't need a world that never had war. We need a world that understands what war is, to never repeat it. No change starts with the world. It starts with one person, one thought, one word, one small but kind action. And then we can imagine a different world. Not a world that never had war, but a world where war is no longer necessary. No one has to sacrifice to protect things that should have been a given. The right to live, to learn, to dream, to love. A world where when you look into the eyes of another person, no matter their skin color, language, or religion, you don't see an enemy, but just another person. A world where courage isn't found on the battlefield, but in the choice not to kill the belief in one another. And you, the one listening right now, what do you think? If tomorrow, a child is born into a world where the shadow of war no longer exists, do you have the courage to live, act, and love, as if you are holding a piece of that future in your hands? If war no longer exists, would humanity be brave enough to live kindly with one another? If you found this journey meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so that every next story we tell together is not just an imagination, but the beginning of real change.